Greetings, folks. Some news here that came across the wire a few hours ago, and it's talking about how the latest North Korean missile test appears to have, found a way to tiptoe over U.S. tripwire by having a really high trajectory, and that goes perhaps even up into space. And so this piece that I'll link you up with goes on to say how for months Washington has been bracing for North Korea to test an intercontinental ballistic missile, waiting to see how close it could get to the United States and how aggressively the Trump administration should react. And now it looks as if Kim Jong-un, the North's 33-year-old leader, as it says here, has a different plan, one intended to improve North Korea's ability to strike the United States without setting off an American military response. And it mentions that instead of going for distance, he has stepped up the testing of missiles that fly high into space. And on Sunday, one reached a height of more than 1,300 miles. And then it would basically plunge down through the atmosphere, mimicking the kind of fiery re-entries a nuclear warhead would undergo if fired over a much longer distance. Instead, the payload lands in waters at just a few hundred miles or so from North Korea's coast in the case of this latest test here. But it mentions here that North Korea can simulate an ICBM warhead on this kind of trajectory, according to David C. Wright, a senior scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a private group over in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this is what he said in an interview, and he went on to say that it's kind of a stepping stone. And John Schilling, an aerospace engineer and an expert on North Korea's missile program, called this relatively low-key experimentation a possible hedge against a military response. It says here, Sunday's test, he goes on to say, could nonetheless represent a substantial advance that might bring the debut of a working intercontinental missile closer than previously estimated. And again, we've seen many reports where people who claim to be in the know have, said that North Korea already has this capability, but that remains to be seen. But it goes on to mention here, in a quote from Michael Morrell, who is a Central Intelligence Agency Deputy Director. He was a Central Intelligence Agency Deputy Director in the Obama administration, and he recently told CBS News that we think they've had enough time to mate a nuclear weapon to a missile, so the threat is now, he goes on to say. And analysts said Sunday's test flight, if conducted on a normal rather than a high trajectory, would have traveled about 3,000 miles. And that is well beyond the sprawling American base at Guam, which is some 2,200 miles away, according to the report here. And more important, it would make the flight distance the longest to date for one of the North's military missiles, and thus represent a major technical success for the nation. On Monday, so earlier yesterday, the North's official news agency said that Mr. Kim celebrated and he hugged rocket officials after Sunday's successful test flight. And Charles P. Vick, who is an expert on the North's missiles at globalsecurity.org, a private research group in Alexandria, Virginia, said the United States had a history of using high missile trajectories as a way to intensify the returning warhead's trial by fire. And he goes on to say here, going really high, he said, gives you a very fast and very brutal re-entry. And so on the heels of that, reports such as this one come out, and I'll link you up with both of them in the description box below the video, but apparently U.S. intelligence is taking this increased North Korean saber rattling more seriously now, and it says here that North Korean claims that its newly tested ballistic missile can carry a nuclear warhead appear to explain a subtle but significant shift in the way U.S. intelligence views Pyongyang. And top officials, it goes on to mention, who once described North Korea as a second-tier adversary with more intent than capability, now refer to it as an increasingly grave threat bent on demonstrating that the United States will soon be within its military reach. And I mean, look no further than all of the recent threats from Kim Jong-un stating he would reduce America to ashes. I mean, the threats go on. He would rain merciless missile strikes, nuclear war he's threatened on multiple occasions. And, of course, you know, he probably is feeling the pressure with the, you know, intimidation tactics being implemented by the U.S. and their allies, you know, South Korea and Japan and what have you over there in that particular region in the Asia Pacific there around the Korean Peninsula. And the piece goes on to mention, in a quote here from Dan Coates, who's the Director of National Intelligence, he said, "We have assessed this as a very significant, potentially existential threat to the United States that has to be addressed." And Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, told this to lawmakers during a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing last week on worldwide threats. And Coates added that, and this is a quote from him, he said, "It is the highest priority, one of the highest, if not the highest priority of the intelligence community at this time." Coates' comments seem to contrast with the view taken by his predecessor, James Clapper, who just over a year ago told lawmakers that among nation states, Russia and China were the prime threats to the United States. And, you know, I mean, many people believe that Russia and China will eventually collude, or not collude, but join sides and ally with North Korea. And, I mean, it remains to be seen what will happen in that regard. But we know Russia and China are certainly walking in lockstep. And that has major implications with end-time Bible prophecy as well, with Russia and China, you know, making up some of the kings of the East, that the 200 million man army that will cross the dried up Euphrates River as prophesied there in the book of Revelation. And so it goes on to say, current and former, earlier this month, then FBI Director James Comey told the Senate Judiciary Committee that Russia poses the greatest threat of any nation on earth, given their intention and their capability. But current and former officials, however, caution the intelligence community's use of increasingly stronger language to describe the threat from North Korea is not so much of a change in thinking as it is a stark acknowledgement of an evolving threat. And likewise, you know, they warn that the elevation of North Korea on its list of threats should in no way diminish the danger posed by Russia or China and what have you. And it goes on to say here in a quote from the CIA and National Security Agency Director General Michael Hayden, and what he told reporters, he said, "It's hard to rack and stack the North Korean and the Russian threat." Basically, he's saying, you know, it's hard to just rank them. And so it goes on to say here that Russia is more global, more powerful, but also in its own way more restrained, he said, while North Korea is more willing to conduct provocative and unpredictable action. Such unpredictability, combined with what officials have described as a ratcheting up of its development and testing program over the past year, has many now describing the North Korean issue as one that has escalated from a regional threat to a global one. And the ever more dire warnings appear to have found a receptive audience, both in the White House and Congress, according to this report here. And likewise, during last week's Intelligence Committee hearing, Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein called the latest assessments on North Korea's activities deeply concerning. And she said, "I would argue that the greatest danger to the United States is North Korea." making the situation even more worrisome for U.S. officials is what they described as a persistent lack of clarity about what is actually going on inside such an isolated country as North Korea. And, of course, in response, if you remember, I reported on this, I think it was last week, but the CIA announced recently the creation of a Korean mission center to get back on our front foot with respect to foreign intelligence collection, according to a quote from CIA Director Mike Pompeo. And so there you have it, folks. The U.S. is taking the North Korean threat more seriously than ever, and I think that's evident. But apparently North Korea's latest missile test and the trajectory that was involved potentially could allow them, enable them with the capability to launch a nuclear attack without tripping off any missiles shooting it down by shooting it at such high altitudes into space and then having it rain down. And as the experts you see here in this piece talk about, would have just a fiery, brutal re-entry that, is that of a blockbuster movie type deal. So, I mean, this just more signs of the times, my friends. I'll put the links in the description box below, as usual. But there you have it. The North Korean threat appears to be being hyped up even more here as tensions simmer over there and things just continue to escalate, and the wars and rumors of wars continue around the globe. And, of course, this is just one aspect of all of that. So until next time, my friends, God bless you guys and much love. Perhaps even up into space. And so this piece that I'll link you up with goes on to say how for months Washington has been bracing for North Korea to test an intercontinental ballistic missile, waiting to see how close it could get to the United States and how aggressively the Trump administration should react. And it mentions that instead of going for distance, he has stepped up the testing of missiles that fly high into space. And on Sunday, one reached a height of more than 1,300 miles. And then it would basically plunge down through the atmosphere, mimicking the kind of fiery re-entries a nuclear warhead would undergo if fired over a much longer distance. Instead, the payload lands in waters at just a few hundred miles or so from North Korea's coast in the case of this latest test here. But greetings, folks. Some news here that came across the wire a few hours ago, and it's talking about how the latest North Korean missile test appears to have found a way to tiptoe over U.S. Tripwire by having a really high trajectory, and that goes and now it looks as if Kim Jong-un, the North's 33-year-old leader, as it says here, has a different plan, one intended to improve North Korea's ability to strike the United States without setting off an American military response.